Cavalry, constant movement, constant risk. You don't stop unless you have to. That's the first thing you learn. Because in the cavalry, stopping isn't just rest, it's risk. Every hour matters, every mile matters. And the longer you stay in one place, the more vulnerable you become. So you keep moving. Hour after hour, day after day, the rhythm becomes constant. Ride, adjust, endure. The sound of hooves replaces silence. The weight of your gear never really leaves your body. And somewhere in the middle of all that, there's hunger. Not sudden, not sharp, just constant. Because eating isn't something you sit down and do anymore, it's something you fit in, whenever you can, however you can, with whatever you still have left. Now imagine trying to carry everything you need on a horse. Weapons, ammunition, personal gear, equipment, and somewhere in that limited space, food. Not much of it. Not enough for comfort, just enough to keep you going. So the question isn't, what do you want to eat? It's something much simpler. What can you carry that won't spoil and won't slow you down? Because whatever you bring has to survive the ride. Heat, cold, movement, time, it all affects what stays usable. Fresh food disappears quickly. Heavy food becomes a burden, and anything fragile doesn't last long. So what's left? Food that's tough, dense, built to endure. Food that doesn't need preparation. Food that can be eaten quickly, sometimes without even stopping. But even that doesn't always last, because supplies run out. Deliveries don't always reach you, and when you're far enough from camp, there's no guarantee anything is coming. So what happens then? What do you eat when what you carried is gone? And how do you keep moving when stopping to cook isn't always an option? In this video, we're stepping into that reality. Not the battles, not the strategy, but the daily life of cavalry soldiers during the Civil War, where movement defined everything, including how you ate. We're going to go through 6 survival meals that soldiers relied on to keep going. Some were standard, some were improvised, and some depended entirely on what could be found along the way. Because in the cavalry, food wasn't just about survival. It had to move with you. And once movement becomes the priority, everything else, including how you eat, has to adapt. That's the difference. Infantry could stop, set up camp, cook in groups, organize supplies. There was structure, imperfect, but still present. Time to prepare, time to distribute rations, time, at least occasionally, to eat something that resembled a proper meal. Cavalry didn't have that luxury. Because cavalry wasn't meant to stay still. Their role was speed, reconnaissance, raids, flanking movements, long-distance travel where stopping too long meant losing the advantage, or worse, being caught unprepared. So everything had to be lighter, faster, more flexible, including food, because whatever you carried had to justify its weight. Every extra pound slowed the horse. Every unnecessary item became a problem over long distances. And when you're riding for hours, sometimes days, without reliable resupply, those small decisions start to matter more than you'd expect. So soldiers made trade-offs. You don't carry what's ideal, you carry what survives. Food had to meet very specific conditions. It had to last without spoiling. It had to resist heat, cold, and movement. It had to be compact. And ideally, it had to require little to no preparation. That immediately eliminates most fresh food, no fresh meat, no soft bread, no meals that depend on timing, temperature, or careful cooking. What remains is something very different. Preserved foods, dried foods, hardened foods, things designed not for enjoyment, but for endurance. And even then, there's another problem: time. Because even if you have something to cook, you might not have the opportunity to do it. Fires take time to start. Cooking takes time to finish, and time, in cavalry operations, is never guaranteed. You might be ordered to move again at any moment. You might be riding through areas where stopping isn't safe. So meals become fragmented. A bite here, a quick stop there, eating while riding, eating while standing, eating without fully stopping at all. Food becomes something you fit into movement, not something that interrupts it. And that changes how you experience it. Because meals are no longer events, they're interruptions, short, practical, functional, just enough to keep going. and then you're back on the horse. But even with all this planning, even with food designed for durability, there's still one major weakness: supply. Because cavalry units don't always stay connected to their supply lines. They move ahead, they spread out, they operate in areas where regular deliveries can't always reach them. And when that happens, what you carried becomes everything you have. There's no guarantee of resupply, no certainty that more food is coming. And once what you brought runs out, you don't go back. You adapt. You start looking outward, to the land, to abandoned areas, to anything that can be gathered, traded, or taken. Because at that point, survival depends on flexibility. And that's what defines cavalry food more than anything else. Not just what it is, but how it changes. At the beginning, it's structured, issued, predictable. But over time, as distance increases and supplies thin out, it becomes something else. Improvised, uncertain, dependent on whatever you can find along the way. And that transition from controlled rations to unpredictable survival is where these meals begin. Because the first ones still come from the system, still part of the plan, still what soldiers were supposed to eat, before everything starts to shift. Food is issued, distributed, accounted for. And even though conditions are far from comfortable, there's still a sense that what you're eating is part of something organized, that you're being supplied, that someone, somewhere, planned for this. And for cavalry soldiers, those plans usually came down to two things: food that could move and food that could last. 1. Hardtack. The food that never changes if there's one item that followed soldiers everywhere. It was this: hardtack, a simple biscuit made from flour, water, and sometimes a bit of salt, baked until it became dry, dense, and nearly indestructible. It didn't spoil easily. It didn't mold quickly. And most importantly, it could survive the journey, which made it perfect, at least on paper, because in reality, hardtack wasn't something you enjoyed, it was something you endured. It was hard enough to crack teeth if you tried to bite into it directly. Often, soldiers had to break it apart with tools, soak it in water, coffee, or whatever liquid they had available just to make it chewable. And even then, it wasn't satisfying. It was dry, bland, repetitive. But it worked because it was consistent. No matter where you were, no matter how far you traveled, hardtack remained the same. It didn't depend on conditions. It didn't change with the weather. It didn't require preparation beyond making it edible. And in a life built on uncertainty, that kind of reliability mattered. But even reliability has limits, because hardtack fills space. It doesn't fully sustain. And over time, eating the same thing day after day starts to wear on you, not just physically, mentally, because food isn't just about calories. It's about variation, texture, something that feels different. And hardtack never changes, so eventually you need something else, something heavier, something that actually feels like food. 2. Salt pork, preservation over preference. That's where salt pork comes in. If hardtack was the base, salt pork was the substance. Pork preserved heavily with salt, designed to last long periods without refrigeration. It was dense, fatty, and packed with calories, exactly what soldiers needed when burning energy on long rides. But like everything else, it came with trade-offs. The salt content was extreme. Before eating, it often needed to be soaked or boiled to remove some of that intensity. Otherwise, it could be overwhelming, too salty to eat comfortably, too harsh on the body if consumed as is. But time wasn't always available, so sometimes soldiers ate it anyway, as it was: strong, heavy, difficult, but effective. Because unlike hardtack, salt pork provided something closer to real sustenance: fat, protein, energy that lasted longer than a dry biscuit ever could. And when combined, hardtack and salt pork, you had something that resembled a complete ration. Not balanced, not enjoyable, but functional. Something that could keep a soldier moving. And that's the key. Because at this stage, food is still doing its job. It's still supporting movement, still maintaining strength, at least to a degree, still part of a system that, while strained, hasn't completely failed. But even here, cracks are already forming. Because these rations depend on supply, on distribution, on the assumption that what you're given today can be replaced tomorrow. And that assumption doesn't always hold. Deliveries get delayed, supplies get reduced, distances increase, and slowly, what was once standard becomes uncertain. Because once the system weakens, these meals don't disappear immediately. They fade, portions get smaller, quality drops, availability becomes inconsistent, until eventually, you're no longer eating what you were issued. You're eating what you can make work. And that's where things begin to change. But bend enough that you can feel it, because hardtack and salt pork might still exist, but they're no longer enough on their own. Portions don't last as long. Supplies don't arrive as consistently. And the rhythm of movement starts interfering with the rhythm of eating. So soldiers begin to adjust, not because they want to, but because they have to. They start taking what they already have and pushing it further. 3. Coffee and crushed rations. Turning fragments into meals coffee was one of the most valued items a soldier could carry, not just for energy, but for routine. A hot drink, something bitter, something familiar. In a constantly shifting environment, coffee became one of the few stable moments in the day, but it also became something else, a tool, because coffee wasn't just consumed, it was used. Hardtack, when crushed and soaked in coffee, softened into something easier to eat. What was once dry and nearly inedible became warm, absorbent, and slightly more tolerable. Salt pork could be added, broken into small pieces, letting the fat mix into the liquid. Not enough to transform it completely, but enough to change the texture, enough to make it feel less like separate items and more like a meal. It wasn't planned that way. No one designed this as a recipe. It emerged from repetition, from trial, from the simple realization that combining things, even basic things, made them easier to eat. And that's what defines the stage. Not new food, but new ways of using what's already there. Because when you can't get more, you learn how to do more with less. 4. Pan-fried scraps. When you find the time, cooking in cavalry life is never guaranteed. But sometimes, briefly, you get the chance. A short stop, a moment where movement pauses just long enough to build a fire, even a small one. And when that happens, soldiers take advantage of it immediately, because heat changes everything. Hardtack can be broken and toasted. Salt pork can be sliced and cooked, releasing fat. And that fat, precious, valuable, becomes a resource. Scraps are added. Whatever small pieces are left, bits saved from previous meals, fragments carried in pockets or bags. And suddenly, something happens. The food improves. Not dramatically, but noticeably. Because frying adds flavor, texture, heat that lasts longer than a quick bite on the move. It turns individual pieces into something cohesive, something that feels closer to intentional. A meal that was assembled, not just eaten. But these moments are rare, and that's what makes them stand out, because most of the time, you don't have the luxury of stopping. Most of the time, you're eating quickly, cold, without preparation. So when you do get the chance to cook, even briefly, it changes the experience. It reminds you what food used to be, what it could be, under different conditions. And that contrast stays with you. Because once you've had something warm, something cooked, something that feels even slightly complete, going back to cold rations becomes harder. But you still do it. Because you don't have a choice. And that's where the shift deepens. Because now, food isn't just limited. It's inconsistent. Some days, you manage something better. Other days, you don't. And over time, that inconsistency becomes the new normal. You stop expecting full meals, you start accepting whatever works. And eventually, even what you carried, even what you stretched, combined, improved, starts to run out. Because nothing you bring lasts forever. And once it's gone, you don't rely on what you packed. You rely on what you can find. Rations, leftovers, small improvements, ways to stretch what you carried just a little further. But now, that's gone. Not all at once, but enough that you notice. Your supplies feel lighter. Your portions don't last. What used to get you through a day barely carries you halfway, and there's no clear sign of when or if anything will replace it. So you stop relying on what you brought and start relying on what's around you. 5. Foraged food. Whatever the land gives you at this stage, the land becomes your supply line. Not officially, not reliably, but practically, because when organized delivery fails or simply can't reach you, the only option left is to look outward. Fields, forests, abandoned farms, anything that might still hold something usable. And that search is never guaranteed. Some days you find something, other days you don't. But when you do, it matters. Wild plants, roots, edible greens, maybe small amounts of grain left behind, sometimes fruit, depending on the region and season, anything that can be gathered quickly and carried without slowing you down. But this isn't controlled foraging. It's opportunistic. You don't have time to carefully select or prepare. You take what you recognize, what you think is safe, what you hope will help, and then you move. Sometimes it's eaten immediately. Other times it's added to whatever you still have left, mixed into a pot if you can stop long enough, or combined with scraps to create something slightly more substantial. But even when it works, it's inconsistent, because the land doesn't provide evenly. One area might offer enough to get by, another, nothing at all. And that unpredictability changes how you think, because now every opportunity matters. Every small find becomes valuable, and every missed chance becomes something you feel later. 6. Stolen or traded food. When movement meets desperation, there's another reality to this stage, because cavalry doesn't just move through empty land. It moves through territory, farms, settlements, places where food exists, but isn't necessarily available. And when supplies run low enough, lines begin to blur. Food might be traded if possible, exchanged for something of value, but not always. Sometimes it's taken, quickly, efficiently, without much room for negotiation. Because at this point, food isn't just about convenience. It's about maintaining the ability to keep moving, and movement is survival. So small quantities, bread, livestock, preserved goods, become critical. Not enough to restore full strength, not enough to create comfort, but enough to extend endurance, enough to push forward a little longer. And like everything else at this stage, it's inconsistent. Some units find more, others find less. Some days offer opportunity, others don't. And that variation becomes part of daily life, because now nothing is stable. Not your meals, not your supply, not even your expectations. You don't assume food is coming. You look for it, constantly. And over time, that changes something fundamental. Because food is no longer something you carry, it's something you chase, something you notice in the environment, something you think about even when you're not eating. Where could it be? What might still be left? What can I use next? And once you reach that point, you're no longer operating within a system, you're operating within uncertainty. Because every meal depends on conditions outside your control. What you find, what you miss, what's already gone, and how long you can keep going before you need more. Because eventually, you always do. By the end of it, one thing stands out. This wasn't just about survival, it was about movement. Because cavalry soldiers didn't have the luxury of stopping to recover, to rebuild, or to wait for better conditions. Everything they ate had to serve one purpose above all else. Keep going. Not full strength, not comfort, just enough. Enough to stay in the saddle, enough to follow orders, enough to not fall behind. And that changes how food works. Because it's no longer about meals, it's about momentum. Every bite becomes part of a larger calculation. What can you eat now without slowing down? What can you save for later? What can carry you through the next stretch of road? And once supplies fade, once structure disappears, that calculation becomes constant. Because now, food isn't something you rely on. It's something you manage, something you search for, something you make work, again and again. And that's what these meals reveal. Not what soldiers preferred, but what they depended on to keep moving when stopping wasn't an option.